The loudest sound of victory is often the one that comes right before a mistake. The first metallic crash echoed across the shoreline at 5:47 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I was already awake, standing on my deck with a mug of coffee in my hand, watching the sun slowly rise over the Atlantic. The air smelled like salt, wet wood, and seagrass. Waves rolled against the rocky shoreline below my property in a steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack of my life. Then came another crash, steel against steel, followed by the low rumble of machinery. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and that morning I watched the final section of my watchtower come down. The structure had stood on that bluff overlooking the ocean for years. My father used it. My grandfather used it before him. During storms, it gave us a clear view of incoming weather. During calm evenings, it offered one of the most spectacular views on the coast. To me, it was part of the property. To Deborah Sutton, it was an eyesore. As the demolition crew worked beneath the pale orange glow of sunrise, Deborah stood near the property boundary wearing a bright windbreaker and a satisfied smile. Even from a distance, I could see how pleased she was. Several homeowners had gathered near the coastal walking path behind her. Some held coffee cups. Others quietly watched the operation. Nobody looked upset. In their minds, a problem was finally being solved. The crane shifted position with a hydraulic hiss. Another section of the tower descended slowly toward the ground. Seagulls circled overhead, their calls mixing with the sound of machinery and crashing waves. The ocean breeze carried the scent of fresh salt water across the bluff. I took another sip of coffee and continued watching. Deborah eventually noticed me standing on the deck. She raised a hand and smiled. "Beautiful morning, Ethan," she called out. "The view is already improving." Improving. That word lingered in my head long after she said it. The watchtower had become the center of a year-long campaign. HOA meetings, complaint letters, architectural reviews, endless discussions about sightlines, neighborhood character, and property values. Deborah had pushed every available process until eventually the pressure became impossible to ignore. In the end, removing the tower simply cost less than continuing the fight. That was the victory she believed she was witnessing. The tower disappeared piece by piece while the neighborhood celebrated. What nobody knew was that I had spent the previous 6 months studying something entirely different. Every evening after work, I sat in my office surrounded by zoning maps, coastal regulations, maritime navigation codes, and permit classifications. While Deborah focused on removing one structure, I focused on understanding what could legally replace it. The answer was hidden deep inside a collection of documents most people would never bother reading. By the time the final section of steel touched the ground, I already knew something Deborah did not. She thought she had won because the tower was gone. She thought the skyline above my property would finally look exactly the way she wanted. Standing there with the morning sun reflecting across the water, I looked at the empty space where the tower had stood and almost smiled. Because what Deborah saw as the end of a story was actually the beginning of a much taller one. The coastline had changed dramatically since my grandfather first bought the property. Old photographs hanging inside my office showed little more than rugged cliffs, fishing boats, and open stretches of shoreline. There were no gated communities back then, no homeowner associations, no architectural review committees deciding what belonged on the horizon. Just families who made their living from the sea and respected the realities of coastal life. The watchtower had been built during that era. It was never designed to impress anyone. It existed for practical reasons. From the top platform, you could spot incoming storms hours before they reached shore. Fishing vessels returning from offshore routes were visible long before they entered the harbor. During hurricane season, the elevated view often provided information that weather reports could not. My father used to spend evenings there with a pair of binoculars watching distant ships cross the horizon. Some of my earliest memories came from climbing those steel steps while the smell of salt water filled the air and waves crashed against the rocks below. To outsiders, it looked like an unusual structure. To my family, it was simply part of the property. Everything changed when the Seaview Bluff subdivision was built less than half a mile away. At first, most residents loved the tower. Real estate brochures even featured it in promotional photographs because it added character to the coastline. Then Deborah Sutton became HOA president. She viewed the shoreline differently. Her vision focused on uniformity, clean sidelines, consistent aesthetics. carefully controlled appearances. The tower did not fit that vision. Over time, complaints began appearing in newsletters. Some residents claimed the structure blocked certain views. Others argued it looked industrial compared to surrounding homes. Deborah transformed those concerns into a campaign. Every few months, another discussion appeared on a meeting agenda, another committee review, another recommendation. Standing inside those meetings often felt surreal. Homeowners discussed the tower as though it had suddenly appeared overnight rather than existing for decades before the first subdivision road was paved. What fascinated me most was how little anyone knew about the actual history of the property. They saw a structure. I saw 3 generations of family memories. They saw an eyesore. I saw a tool that had served the coastline longer than many of the houses criticizing it had existed. By the final year of the dispute, Deborah had become remarkably confident. She spoke about the tower's removal as an inevitable outcome rather than a possibility. The pressure never came from a single decision. It came from accumulation, review after review, recommendation after recommendation, small steps that slowly narrowed available options. While all of that unfolded publicly, something else was happening privately. Every evening after work, I sat inside my office overlooking the ocean. The room smelled like old maps, sea air, and coffee. Zoning charts covered the desk. Coastal regulations filled binders stacked against the wall. Maritime infrastructure classifications occupied entire folders. I spent hundreds of hours reading material most people would never willingly open. At first, I was simply trying to understand what rights remained available to property owners along the shoreline. Then one evening, I found a classification buried deep within a coastal development document. I remember staring at the page while waves crashed against the cliffs outside. The discovery seemed almost too simple, and the more I researched it, the more certain I became that Deborah had spent years focusing on exactly the wrong structure. The discovery happened on a windy Thursday night, while rain rattled against the windows of my office. The ocean beyond the cliffs was hidden behind darkness, but I could still hear the waves crashing below. Every few seconds, a stronger gust shook the glass and sent the old weather vane outside spinning wildly. My desk was covered with documents. Coastal development regulations, engineering manuals, county zoning maps, maritime navigation guidelines. Most people would have given up long before reaching that point. I almost had. For months, every answer seemed to lead to another restriction. Every regulation closed another door. Then I found a section buried inside a coastal infrastructure classification guide. At first, it looked insignificant. Just another technical document filled with definitions and references. But one paragraph caught my attention. I read it twice, then a third time. The language was surprisingly specific. Certain observation structures faced height limitations and architectural review requirements. Maritime navigation structures, however, were regulated under an entirely different classification. I sat back in my chair and stared at the page while the wind howled outside. The distinction seemed small until I began tracing the references. One document led to another, then another. Within 2 hours, I had opened 6 separate regulatory codes. By midnight, an entirely different picture was starting to emerge. The more I researched, the more obvious it became. Deborah had spent years fighting a structure that belonged to one category while completely ignoring another category that operated under a different set of rules. The following week became a blur of meetings and research. I spoke with surveyors, coastal planners, permit specialists, engineers. Not one of those conversations involved arguments about neighborhood aesthetics. Nobody cared about HOA newsletters or committee opinions. They cared about classifications, measurements, safety requirements, and compliance standards. The difference was refreshing. While the HOA world revolved around preferences, the infrastructure world revolved around definitions. One afternoon, I sat across from a coastal development consultant whose office overlooked the harbor. Fishing boats drifted below the window while gulls circled overhead. Salt air drifted through an open balcony door. He reviewed several property documents and then looked up at me. "If the project meets these requirements," he said, tapping a section of the paperwork, "the review process is completely different." That sentence stayed with me during the drive home. Completely different. By sunset, I was back on the bluff overlooking the ocean. The empty space where the old structure once stood seemed larger now. Waves rolled beneath the cliffs while orange sunlight reflected across the water. In the distance, a cargo ship moved slowly along the horizon. For the first time since the removal, I could clearly see the path forward. Deborah believed she had finally forced the property into compliance with her vision of the neighborhood. What she did not understand was that her victory had created the perfect opportunity. If the original structure had remained standing, I never would have spent months studying coastal infrastructure law. I never would have found the classification hidden inside those documents. And I certainly never would have realized that the most interesting thing allowed on that section of coastline was significantly taller than the structure she worked so hard to remove. 3 weeks later, the first survey flags appeared on the property. Small orange markers stretched across the bluff overlooking the ocean, their bright colors standing out against the gray coastal grass. The morning fog had not fully lifted yet, and the shoreline below was wrapped in a thin blanket of mist. Waves rolled against the rocks with a steady rhythm while gulls drifted through the cool air. I was standing near the old tower site when the survey crew finished their measurements and loaded equipment back into their trucks. Everything about the process looked ordinary, professional, quiet, which was exactly why nobody paid much attention. At first, Deborah seemed unconcerned. She probably assumed I was planning a simple landscaping project or perhaps rebuilding a smaller structure that would still fall under the same restrictions she had spent years enforcing. A few days later, however, something changed. Permit notices appeared in the county database. Engineering reviews moved forward. Coastal compliance approvals entered processing. One afternoon, I stopped by the harbor after a meeting and overheard 2 local contractors discussing a project on the bluff. Neither realized I was the owner. They were simply talking shop. One mentioned foundation specifications. The other referenced structural requirements for coastal visibility. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it confirmed something important. Word was beginning to spread. Back at the subdivision, curiosity was growing. Residents who had celebrated the tower's removal started noticing increased activity near the property. Trucks arrived carrying equipment. Engineers visited the site. Survey crews returned multiple times. Every new vehicle generated fresh speculation. Deborah eventually approached me during a community event held near the marina. The air smelled like salt water and grilled seafood, while families wandered between vendor booths along the waterfront. She smiled politely and asked what I was planning. I returned the smile and answered honestly. A fully permitted project. The expression on her face changed for only a second, but I noticed it. She wanted details. I gave none. Over the next several weeks, preparations continued. Soil testing, structural reviews, site evaluations. Every step followed procedures that had little to do with HOA preferences and everything to do with engineering requirements. That difference would soon become very important. One evening I sat on the deck watching the sunset paint the horizon orange and gold. The ocean stretched endlessly beyond the cliffs while fishing boats returned toward the harbor. A stack of approved documents rested on the table beside me. Permit numbers, compliance certifications, survey records. Every page represented another piece of a foundation that Deborah could not influence. Across the subdivision, lights slowly flickered on as evening settled over the coast. Somewhere inside one of those houses, Deborah was likely reviewing HOA matters, completely unaware of what the approved plans actually contained. That was the irony of the entire situation. She had spent years studying ways to remove one structure while never once studying the regulations governing another. The empty space on the bluff no longer looked empty to me. I could already see what was coming. The survey markers outlined it. The permits authorized it. The engineering plans defined it. And with every passing day, the realization moved closer to becoming visible to everyone else. The tower was gone, but the foundation of something far more noticeable had already begun. The first concrete foundation was poured on a bright Tuesday morning beneath a sky so clear it almost looked artificial. The ocean reflected deep shades of blue while sunlight danced across the water beyond the cliffs. From my deck, I could hear generators humming, trucks reversing, and construction crews calling measurements to one another over the steady sound of waves below. The project had finally moved from paperwork into reality. For months, everything existed inside folders, engineering plans, permit applications, and regulatory reviews. Now it was becoming visible. And visibility was exactly what Deborah had spent years worrying about. By lunchtime, Several residents had gathered along the coastal walking path overlooking the site. Some watched quietly. Others pointed toward the construction activity while exchanging theories. Rumors spread faster than concrete dried. One person claimed I was building a new observation platform. Another insisted it would be a storage structure. A third confidently declared that county officials would eventually stop whatever was happening. I found those conversations amusing because every assumption was wrong. Later that afternoon, I noticed Deborah standing near the property boundary. The ocean breeze pushed her hair back while she studied the site from behind a pair of sunglasses. She remained there for nearly 20 minutes, watching, calculating, trying to understand why a project she thought had ended months earlier suddenly seemed larger than before. The answer remained hidden inside permit classifications she had never bothered reading. Over the next several days, the foundation continued taking shape. Steel reinforcements appeared. Specialized materials arrived. Survey crews returned to verify alignment and elevation measurements. Every step followed approved plans. Every inspection passed. Every requirement was documented. The process felt almost routine from my perspective. My background in engineering projects taught me that successful construction depends on preparation long before equipment ever arrives. Deborah, however, viewed the situation differently. To her, the growing foundation represented uncertainty, and uncertainty made people nervous. One evening, I attended a local harbor commission meeting unrelated to the project. As I walked through the building, I overheard conversations about the activity on the bluff. Contractors recognized the permit numbers. Engineers recognized the design specifications. People familiar with coastal infrastructure were beginning to understand what was happening. The realization spread quietly. No dramatic announcements. No headlines. Just professionals connecting details. Back at the subdivision, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. HOA discussions that once celebrated the removal of the old structure now focused on questions. What exactly was being built? Why had county approvals moved forward so quickly? Could the HOA stop it? Those questions generated more meetings, more calls, and more frustration. Unfortunately for Deborah, every inquiry produced the same answer. The project complied with applicable regulations. Standing on the shoreline one evening after the crews left for the day, I looked across the partially completed foundation while seagulls drifted overhead in the fading light. The smell of salt and concrete mixed in the cool air. The empty space that once existed on the bluff was disappearing. Something new was rising from it. Something Deborah had never expected. For years, she focused on making sure one structure came down. She never stopped to consider what might eventually rise in its place. And as the foundation grew larger with each passing day, that oversight was becoming impossible to ignore. The moment Deborah finally learned what was being built arrived on a windy afternoon, nearly 2 months after construction began. Dark clouds moved across the horizon, while whitecaps formed on the ocean below the cliffs. I was reviewing inspection reports inside the site trailer when one of the engineers walked in holding a newspaper folded under his arm. He set it on the table and pointed to a small article discussing coastal infrastructure projects approved throughout the county. My project was listed among them. Not by name, by classification. I looked at the article and smiled. The designation that appeared in print was the same one I had spent months researching inside dusty regulatory documents. Later that evening, I attended a public coastal planning meeting. The room overlooked the harbor, and large windows framed a view of fishing boats rocking gently in their slips. Salt air drifted through the building every time someone opened a door. Representatives from multiple agencies reviewed updates on shoreline projects, maintenance schedules, and navigation improvements. Near the back of the room, I noticed Deborah. She looked unusually serious. Gone was the confidence she carried during the Watchtower dispute. In its place was uncertainty. During a break, she approached me. "What exactly are you building?" she asked. For the first time since this entire situation began, there was no triumph in her voice. Only concern. I answered honestly. A fully permitted maritime navigation structure. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt longer. Deborah stared at me as though she was waiting for a different answer. When none came, she thanked me and walked away. The next few weeks were fascinating to watch. HOA board members began making calls. Attorneys reviewed documents. Questions were submitted to county offices. Meetings were scheduled. Every avenue led back to the same conclusion. The project complied with regulations. Engineers confirmed it. Inspectors confirmed it. Coastal authorities confirmed it. The classification placed the structure under a completely different framework than the one Deborah had relied upon during her campaign against the tower. Meanwhile, construction moved steadily forward. The central shaft began rising above the bluff, visible from almost every section of the subdivision. Workers installed structural components while cranes swung carefully against the backdrop of the ocean. Each morning, residents woke up to find the project slightly taller than it had been the day before. Curiosity turned into disbelief. Disbelief turned into frustration. The irony was impossible to ignore. Deborah had spent years arguing that the original structure dominated the skyline. Now something significantly more prominent was emerging directly from the same location. One evening, I stood near the shoreline as the setting sun painted the ocean gold. The partially completed structure cast a long shadow across the bluff. Seagulls circled overhead while waves crashed against the rocks below. From that vantage point, I could see the subdivision in the distance. Tiny groups of residents stood along the walking path looking toward the construction site. The realization was finally spreading through the community. The old tower had not been the end of anything. It had simply been the first chapter. And with every new section lifted into place above the coastline, the true scale of Deborah's mistake was becoming impossible for anyone to miss. By early autumn, the structure had become impossible to ignore. Every morning the coastline looked slightly different. What began as survey markers and concrete foundations now rose high above the bluff, visible from nearly every road leading into the subdivision. The ocean wind whistled around newly installed sections, while crews worked methodically beneath bright blue skies. From my deck, I often watched the progress with a cup of coffee in hand. The smell of salt water mixed with fresh paint, cut lumber, and ocean air. Below, waves continued their endless rhythm against the rocks. Above, gulls circled around the growing silhouette as if trying to understand why a new landmark had appeared along their familiar route. The most interesting part was not the construction itself. It was the reaction. Residents who had once celebrated the removal of the old structure now gathered along the walking path every evening. Some brought folding chairs. Others stopped during evening walks just to stare. Conversations spread throughout the neighborhood. Every day produced a new rumor. Some people claimed the county would stop the project before completion. Others insisted hidden restrictions would eventually force modifications. Yet every week another inspection occurred. Another approval was issued. Another stage passed successfully. The paperwork remained stronger than speculation. Deborah seemed determined to find an answer that would change the outcome. I learned through local contacts that multiple inquiries had been submitted regarding height limitations, coastal visibility standards, structural classifications, and jurisdictional authority. Each review reached the same conclusion. The project complied with applicable requirements. There was nothing unusual about that result from my perspective. The entire reason I spent months researching regulations before construction began was to avoid surprises. Deborah had spent years fighting one set of rules. She never imagined a completely different set existed. One afternoon, while returning from a meeting at the harbor, I noticed several HOA board members standing near the coastal overlook facing the site. Their expressions said everything. They were not looking at a problem they could solve. They were looking at a reality they could not change. As construction continued, more details became visible. The exterior finish, the observation deck, the architectural elements designed specifically for coastal conditions. Every addition made the true purpose of the structure increasingly obvious. The irony was almost unbelievable. The replacement was not merely legal. It was designed according to standards far more comprehensive than anything applied to the original tower. The ocean seemed to emphasize the point every evening. Golden sunlight reflected across the water while the new structure cast a long shadow across the bluff. The subdivision beneath it looked smaller than before. One evening, I walked to the edge of the property just as the sun disappeared below the horizon. The air carried the familiar scent of sea salt and approaching rain. In the distance, lights from neighborhood homes began appearing one by one. Behind me, construction crews had already left for the day. Ahead of me stood the nearly completed structure that Deborah unintentionally made possible. She believed removing the old tower would restore control over the skyline. Instead, She created the conditions for something far more prominent to rise in exactly the same place. And as the final stages approached, everyone along the coastline was beginning to realize the same thing. The project was no longer about what had been removed. It was about what was about to be revealed. The final review meeting took place on a cold afternoon with strong ocean winds rattling the windows of the county administration building. By then, the structure on the bluff was nearly complete. Its silhouette had become a permanent part of the coastline, visible from the marina, the highway overlook, and almost every street inside the subdivision. The meeting itself was not dramatic. That was the interesting part. After months of speculation, rumors, complaints, and questions, the outcome came down to paperwork. Representatives from multiple departments reviewed inspection reports, engineering certifications, coastal compliance approvals, environmental assessments, and construction records. Every document matched. Every requirement had been satisfied. Every permit remained valid. I sat quietly near the back of the room listening to discussions that sounded remarkably similar to the conversations I had been having with engineers and planners for nearly a year. Measurements, standards, classifications, safety requirements. Nobody discussed neighborhood aesthetics anymore. Nobody talked about personal preferences. The process had moved beyond opinions. Deborah arrived carrying a thick binder filled with notes and correspondence. She looked determined, but also exhausted. The confidence that once defined every HOA meeting had gradually been replaced by frustration. Several times throughout the review, questions were raised regarding visibility, height, and neighborhood impact. Each concern received the same response. The project complied with the applicable regulations governing its classification. Hearing those words repeated again and again felt almost surreal. They were the same regulations I had spent countless evenings studying while Deborah focused on HOA authority. By the end of the session, there was little left to debate. The approval stood. Construction would continue through completion. Outside, gray clouds drifted above the harbor while fishing boats rocked gently against their moorings. As people exited the building, small groups formed in the parking lot discussing the outcome. Most conversations sounded very different than they would have sounded a year earlier. Residents were no longer asking how to stop the project. They were asking how nobody realized it was possible in the first place. That question had a simple answer. Everyone had been focused on what existed. Almost nobody studied what could exist. Over the following weeks, finishing crews arrived on the bluff. Exterior details were completed. Safety systems were tested. Final inspections were scheduled. Every morning brought another visible sign that the project was approaching completion. The subdivision seemed quieter now. The endless debates had faded. Reality has a way of ending arguments once it becomes large enough to see from every window. One evening, I stood near the shoreline while the setting sun painted the ocean with streaks of gold and orange. The nearly finished structure towered above the cliffs behind me. Seagulls drifted through the wind currents surrounding it while waves exploded against the rocks below. The air smelled like salt, fresh paint, and seagrass. Looking across the water, I thought about the first day Deborah celebrated the removal of the old tower. She believed she had solved the problem. What she never understood was that she had also removed the one thing preventing me from discovering a much bigger opportunity. Now, with final approvals complete and construction entering its last stage, the entire coastline was about to witness the result of that mistake. The official lighting ceremony happened on a clear evening in late spring. The sky above the coastline was painted with shades of orange, gold, and deep blue as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon. A steady ocean breeze moved across the bluff, carrying the familiar scent of salt water and seagrass. Waves rolled against the rocks below exactly as they had for generations. Yet the view was different now. Rising 60 feet above the shoreline stood the completed structure that nobody in the subdivision had expected to see. Its white exterior reflected the final sunlight of the day, while polished metal details glimmered against the darkening sky. From the harbor to the coastal highway, it was visible from nearly every vantage point along the shoreline. What fascinated me most was how naturally it seemed to belong there. As evening approached, residents gathered along the walking paths overlooking the coast. Some arrived out of curiosity. Others simply wanted to witness the conclusion of a story that had consumed community conversations for more than a year. The atmosphere felt strangely peaceful. There were no protests, No heated debates. No emergency meetings. Just people standing quietly beside the ocean, watching a project become part of the landscape. Deborah was there too. I noticed her standing near the back of the crowd, hands folded, looking toward the bluff. She appeared thoughtful rather than angry. Months of reviews, consultations, legal questions, and regulatory examinations had produced the same answer every single time. The structure was fully compliant. The process had been followed correctly. The approvals were valid. Reality had settled in. Shortly after sunset, the final system test began. Engineers completed a series of checks while the sky darkened overhead. Harbor lights flickered on in the distance. Fishing boats moved slowly across the water. Then, at precisely the scheduled time, the beacon illuminated for the first time. A soft glow appeared above the coastline. Conversation stopped. People watched as the light rotated across the ocean horizon. It was elegant, practical, visible for miles. Standing there, I could not help remembering the morning when the old tower came down. Deborah believed removing that structure would restore the skyline she wanted. Instead, it created the opportunity for something far more significant to take its place. The irony was almost perfect. Had she left the original structure alone, none of this would have happened. Her campaign accomplished exactly the opposite of its intended goal. As the crowd gradually dispersed, I remained near the shoreline listening to the waves below. The beacon continued its steady rotation across the dark water. Behind me, neighborhood lights stretched across the subdivision. Ahead of me, the ocean disappeared into the night. The entire conflict suddenly felt distant. Not because I had forgotten it, but because the outcome no longer required explanation. It stood there in plain sight for everyone to see. Deborah thought she removed a tower. What she really removed was the only thing shorter than the structure that replaced it. In the end, there was no dramatic revenge, no public humiliation, no final confrontation, just a lesson written in steel, concrete, permits, and patience. Power may influence decisions for a while, but understanding the rules can reshape an entire skyline. And every evening after that, as the beacon swept across the ocean and the subdivision below, it quietly reminded everyone of the same truth. Justice is not louder than authority. It is simply built on a stronger foundation.